Section 9.5, we're going to learn more about solving quadratic equations. What we've learned so far is that sometimes we can solve quadratic equations by factoring. In order to factor, you need to have your equation set up, and you need to have 0 on one side, and then hopefully the left-hand side factors. In this case it does. It's x minus 6 and x minus 3 equals 0. So we take x minus 6 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and we get our two answers, x equals 6, x equals 3. Now the reality is factoring doesn't always work, and we'll see some examples of that in just a minute. We've also learned that sometimes we can solve quadratic equations by using the square root method. Now, this first problem that we did, the square root method would not work. To do the square root method, you have to have an x squared, but no x piece, so that's why this one wouldn't work. Or you have to have a parenthesis like this with a square on it. So this one we could factor, but we could not use the square root method. This one, I don't think we can factor, but we can use the square root method. So to use the square root method, we've got to get the square thing all by itself first, which means we add 7 to both sides. 2 times x minus 6 squared equals 22. We divide both sides by 2. X minus 6 squared is 11, and then this is why this is called the square root method. To get rid of that square, we do a square root on both sides. And when we do square roots, we remember that there are two of them, a positive one and a negative one. We have x minus 6 equals plus and minus square root of 11. So we add x equals 6 plus and minus square root of 11. Alright, so that's what we've learned so far. Now, here comes the new stuff. Some quadratic equations can't be solved by either of the two methods above. This one we cannot use the square root method because we have an x squared and we have an x. And you can try all you want, that does not factor. So what we do is we learn a new method, and this new method is called completing the square. Here's how this works. X squared minus 4x minus 1 equals 0. The first thing we do, since it doesn't factor, we add the 1 to the other side. If it did factor, we want to have 0 over here. This one doesn't, so we add the 1 over. And this is the completing the square step right here. To complete the square, give it a different color to make this stand out. We take this number right here, the negative 4. We divide it by 2, and then we square it. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared happens to be 4. What we're going to do is we're going to take this number, 4, and we're going to add it to both sides. X squared minus 4x plus 4 equals 1 plus 4. Alright, the right hand side, nothing shocking there, 1 plus 4 is 5. The left hand side, this is why this is called completing the square. The left hand side now factors as something special. If you check it, it factors as x minus 2 and x minus 2 again. I'm going to write that as x minus 2, whole thing squared. Notice what we've done. We've taken a problem that we could not use the square root method on. We did a process called completing the square, which gives us something squared, and now we're back to something very similar to this, where we have a parenthesis, a square equals a number. Now we can solve using the square root method. So that's what completing the square does. Completing the square takes problems that you can't use the square root method on. You do a little bit of work, and now you can use the square root method. We take the square root of both sides, and as always, we remember when we do square roots, there are two of them. So x minus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 5, and we add. X equals 2 plus or minus square root of 5. Alright, and that method is called completing the square. Let's do some more examples. Solve each of the following by completing the square. Alright, so to complete the square, to go through the steps again, we add the number to the other side. We take the number in the middle, which is a 6. We divide it by 2, and then we square it. So you always take the number in the middle, always divide it by 2, and always square it. That gives us 3 squared, which is 9. We're going to take the number 9 and add it to both sides. X squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 5 plus 9. The right-hand side is very easy. It's 14. The left-hand side, this now should factor, and you can try it. You'll find it has to be x and x, and 3 and 3. So I'm going to write it as x plus 3 squared. Alright, square root both sides. X plus 3 equals plus and minus square root of 14. So x is negative 3 plus and minus square root of 14. Alright, you get to try the next two. Give them a shot. Move the 9 over. Take the negative 2, divide it by 2, and then square it, and that's your number to add. Alright, now, these do get a little harder. And the way these get a little harder is problems 4 and 5. Now, you might have noticed for each of the problems that I've done, and you've done, this number in the middle was even. We had a 4 there, a 6, oops, you can't see what I'm pointing at, there it is, 6, negative 2, and 8, they were all even. And it's nice when that number is even, because when you have to do this divide by 2 thing, an even number always divides by 2. So these get a bit harder when this number in the middle is not even. So let's see how that works. X squared plus 5x equals 3. Starts exactly the same way. Now comes the nasty stuff. We have to take 5, divide it by 2, and square it. Well, 5 divided by 2 doesn't come out nice. We're going to leave it as a fraction. We're going to leave it as 5 halves, and we're going to square it. To square it, we square the top, and we square the bottom. So there's the number that we have to add to both sides. X squared plus 5x plus 25 over 4 equals 3 plus 25 over 4. Alright, the right-hand side, I'm going to use my calculator. 3 plus 25 over 4. Calculator says that's 37 over 4. The question is, how does the left-hand side factor? And here's the big key. Notice, back up here, we did 6 divided by 2 and we got a 3. And the number that was right there was a 3. Notice here, we did negative 4 divided by 2, that was a negative 2, and the number right there was a negative 2. So, the number that goes here is x, and then it's the number that you had right before you did the squaring. In this case, it's x plus 5 halves. Alright, so check that that worked on 2 and 3 that you did. Check to make sure that the number that you had right before you did the squaring is the number that ended up right there. Again, that's kind of a self-built-in check. We square root both sides. X plus 5 halves equals plus or minus the square root of 37 over 4. Now I'm going to write this as plus and minus the square root of 37 over 2, because the square root of 4 down on bottom happens to be a nice number. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 37, not a nice number. X equals negative 5 halves plus or minus the square root of 37 over 2. You could leave your answer that way, that's perfectly fine, or you might notice that these do have a common denominator. So sometimes we write this as negative 5 plus and minus square root of 37 all over 2. Alright, give number 5 a try. Again, number 5 because that number is odd, you will have fractions. Alright, the last thing. Notice on all the previous problems that we did, this number was always the number 1. Again, these get harder when this number is not the number 1. Alright, so here's what we have to do. Starts the same way. 2x squared plus 8x equals 1. Now we need this number to be the number 1, which means we have to divide everything by 2. Squared plus 4x equals a half. Now we do things exactly the way we've been doing them. Nothing changes. I take the 4, I divide it by 2, and I square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. So there's my number. X squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 1/2 plus 4. The left-hand side factors nicely. It's x, and then it's this number right here before we did the squaring, so that's a plus 2 squared equals 4.5. I'm going to write it as 9/2. Square root both sides. X plus 2 is plus or minus square root of 9/2. So x is negative 2 plus or minus square root of 9/2. Perfectly correct answer as far as I'm concerned. However, when you go to do your homework on MyLab, it's not going to like that you have a square root of 2. So what you're going to do is you're going to simplify this. You're going to write this as negative 2 plus or minus 3 divided by square root of 2, because the square root of 9 happens to be a nice number. Square root of 9 is 3. And then, like I say, it's not going to like that you have a square root on bottom. So you're going to multiply top and bottom by square root of 2, and you're going to write your answer as negative 2 plus or minus 3 square roots of 2 over 2, because square root of 2 times square root of 2 is square root of 4. Square root of 4 is a nice number. So, you can leave your answer like that on MyLab and then send me an email that says, hey, I got the correct answer, I just didn't write it in the right form. Or you can write it that way and you'll get the right answer right away. If you write it this way on MyLab, it's fine. Let me know. I'll go in and I'll correct it. Change the grade for you. Alright, one more for me to do and then one more for you to do. Number 7. I'm going to have lots and lots of fractions. 4x squared plus 3x equals 6. This number has to be the number 1, so we divide everything by 4. That gives us x squared plus 3/4 x equals 3/2. Alright, to find my number, I take 3/4 and I divide it by 2 and I square it. 3/4 divided by 2 is 3/4 times a half. Think of that as being 2 over 1. Flip and multiply. So that's 3/8 squared, which is 9 over 64. Alright, so I warned you, lots of fractions. Use your calculator if you're not comfortable with fractions. X squared plus 3/4 x plus 9 over 64 equals 3/2 plus 9 over 64. The left-hand side is x, something squared. Always a number right before the squaring, so it's x plus 3/8 squared. And then on the right-hand side, 3/2 plus 9 over 64. Yes, I'm using my calculator. Use your calculator too. 105 over 64. And notice I'm leaving all my answers in fractions. You will leave all your answers in fractions also. No decimals here. Square root both sides. X plus 3/8 is plus or minus the square root of 105 over 64. So x is negative 3/8 plus or minus the square root of 105 divided by square root of 64 is a nice number, that's 8. And again, typically, since we have the same denominator, we write it as one thing, negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 105 over 8. But again, if you left it like this on a quiz or a test, it would be fine. And of course, that's a nice answer too. All right, so number 8's yours. Yes, you're going to have lots of fractions. Again, use your calculator to deal with those fractions.